amazing how openness is contagious. It's like as soon as you admit that you're fucked up, everybody's comfortable admitting that they're fucked up. I heard this term, I didn't make it up, but I like it. Cathartic normalization. That if you're willing to talk about the most embarrassing stuff that ever happened to you, then it can be very useful. For me, it was closer to the imposter syndrome that you described. That I was 28 when I arrived at ABC News, and I had spent a bunch of years in local news. All of a sudden, I was working with huge names in the news industry. Peter Jennings and Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer, gigantic figures in the news who I had grown up watching. So I did feel a little bit out of my depth and nervous and scrutinized and the need to prove myself.
Were you doubtful that this book was going to be any good for anyone?
Every day. I shopped the book around to a million publishers. Nobody wanted it. It's not like the world started treating me like I was the Dalai Lama. And I did not start to think I was the Dalai Lama. I have lots of flaws, but I'm not that delusional. I think because the whole brand was built around me being a fuck up. It was all based on a cocaine-fueled panic attack. And the book was called 10% Happier. I think built into the whole endeavor was the idea of, oh yeah, this is an unlikely meditation evangelist. I had been an anchor man for 20 years leading up to that, which is an inherently bullshit job, right? I mean, like it's an important job and I loved doing it and I actually miss it, but you're not yourself when you're anchoring the news. At least I wasn't.
Hey, so a lot of you all have been reaching out with guest suggestions. Light, you should interview President Obama. You should interview Oprah Winfrey. And look, I'm definitely sending out invitations to people like that all the time. But something that you can do right now to help make it easier for those kinds of guests to say yes to my invitation is to subscribe to my channel. Because that's the first thing that their gatekeepers are going to do is they want to see how big is this podcast. And one of the go-to metrics for determining the size of a podcast is to look at how many subscribers a channel has. That's why you always hear podcasters like me saying, please subscribe to this channel. I'm just being honest. So if you could just hit the subscribe button right now, that's literally the best way that you can help me get you bigger guests on this show. All right. Thank you so much in advance for that. And back to the show.
When people imagine, I've got this crappy job and I'm not doing what I'm here to do, right? That kind of experience could lead to a sense of panic or anxiety, like I'm falling behind. But then you have on the other end of the spectrum, you feel like you're very much doing what you're here to do. And yet you have a little bit of imposter syndrome, like they're going to figure me out, that I'm not this smart journalist or this wise meditation teacher who's always got,
Yes,
a layer of calmness beneath. So
yeah.
How do you think about that in relation to feeling those things like panic and anxiety? If someone's listening to this, how would they be able to use that in a way to determine if I'm in the place where I'm supposed to be?
I think there's a lot in what you just said. I do think panic, the body is sending us signals all the time. We may not care to listen. And so I could imagine a scenario in which the body is telling you there's something about the way you're living that is off. And that if you don't listen for long enough, it could scream at you in the form of a panic attack. So I could imagine that happening. For me, I don't think, maybe clearly my body was saying, stop doing cocaine. But it wasn't about, you're in the wrong line of work. For me, it was closer to the imposter syndrome that you described, that I was quite young. I was 28 when I arrived at ABC News, and I had spent a bunch of years in local news in New England, and all of a sudden I was working with, huge names in the news industry. People, it's very sad to me that I'm going to list these names, and some of your listeners probably haven't heard of them, but Peter Jennings and Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer, gigantic figures in the news who I had grown up watching. And so I did feel, I don't know if I'm like an imposter so much, but a little bit out of my depth and nervous and scrutinized, and this need to prove myself. And it's back to this social approbation that we discussed earlier, that it can, knowing at any given moment that Peter Jennings is watching me and evaluating whether he wants me to be on the show that night, or that on the other side of the room when I had a panic attack was sitting Diane Sawyer and Charles Gibson, two massive figures in the news, that absolutely fuels the fear, for sure. I would say for people who feel like they're in the wrong line of work, I've recently been corrected because I have often said you should follow your passion. Hopefully, I've said it in less hackneyed terms. But it's been pointed out to me recently that's a bit of it's an argument for the advantaged. Many people don't have the ability to follow whatever dream they may have. And some people may not simply be that passionate about any one thing. I've been lucky and so have you, like that I was passionate about journalism. Now I'm passionate about mental health, meditation, happiness. And so I've always had something that I've just loved, and that's really helped me pursue it. But for many people, there isn't something like that. Never mind two things. And the passion can emerge through finding something you like well enough and committing. And the interest and the energy can emerge from that in some cases.
Yeah.
And then finally, to say that I've had some guests on my show recently who've educated me about the fact that, we may be spending too much time defining ourselves by our jobs. And you may have a job that you're stuck in that feels like a dead end job, but maybe you shouldn't define yourself by your work. Maybe you define yourself by like the kind of person you are, the kind of friend you are, the kind of parent you are, the volunteer work you do, the hobbies you have. And that's just all been a very useful shift for me in terms of like how I talk about work stuff publicly.
Yeah, I wrote in my recent book, don't even worry about trying to find your passion or your purpose. Just follow your curiosity. And then through following your curiosity, eventually your purpose or whatever it is that you're meant to do in this season of your life will eventually find you. And so you have this panic attack, you go home, and somehow, some way you find yourself in the meditation. So walk us through that process. What was your relationship with meditation like prior to that day? And how did you find yourself embracing this practice?
I think my attitude about meditation was somewhere between I never thought about it and openly hostile. Like I said, my parents were ex-hippies, and I have this formative memory of them forcing me to go to a yoga class when I was 5 years old. And the teacher did not like my jeans and made me take them off and do the class in my tidy whities. And so I hated yoga and all things. I also then went to Colby College, which was filled with lots of Grateful Dead listening hippies, which I did not like. And so I hated anything having to do with the new age or crystals or incense or anything like that. So I was completely ignorant about meditation. And to be clear, it's not like I started meditating as soon as I had the panic attack and quit doing drugs. There was a strange journey that I talk about in my book that I won't bore you with now, but ultimately over several years, I landed through several misadventures on meditation. And what changed my mind was the science. So this was about 2009. I like to joke that this is the first time in my life I've ever been ahead of a trend because meditation wasn't cool at that time. But I started to notice all of the science that strongly suggests that meditation can be very good for you, rewire key parts of your brain, be very good for anxiety and depression, both of which I've struggled since I was a little kid. So I that's what really got me interested. And I would say one other thing, which is that one of the steps along the way towards me getting interested was I read a book by a guy named Eckhart Tolle, who I know you've heard of him, but some listeners might not have. He's a huge best-selling self-help writer. I had never heard of him when one of my colleagues recommended I read his book. And there was a lot I didn't like about Eckhart Tolle, but there was one thing I really liked because he was the first person who ever pointed out to me that we all have a voice in our heads, this inner narrator that is chasing you out of bed every morning and is yammering at you all day long, and you're constantly like in its thrall, wanting stuff, not wanting stuff, judging people, comparing yourself to other people, thinking about the past or the future instead of whatever's happening right now. And when you're unaware of this nonstop conversation, which, if we broadcast aloud, you would be locked up. When you're unaware of this chaos and cacophony, it just owns you. You just act out every little thought like as my meditation teacher says, like a tiny dictator. And totally, that wasn't actually his insight, but he was the first person I ever heard talk about it. And then I got turned on to the Buddha, who was, I think, really onto this 2,600 years before Eckhart Tolle. And I got very interested in Buddhism and meditation. And then I started to learn about the science, and I started to do it myself for a couple minutes every day. And I noticed that it was helpful. I often tell the story about how a month after I started meditating, my wife and I were at a cocktail party, and I overheard her say to somebody, "Yeah, Dan started meditating and he's a little bit less of a shitbag." And I thought that was really funny. And but it was also like a really good data point, because often it's the other people in your life who notice change before you do. And so somewhere in that time, I got the idea of like, oh, I'm reading all these books about meditation. They're really helpful, but I suspect other skeptics like me would find them annoying. So maybe I'll write a book that uses the F word a lot and tells really embarrassing stories and has a sense of humor and is really directly aimed at skeptics through the humor, through the reliance on science, and finally through something that you and I talked about and that you personally modeled a few minutes ago, Light, which is through this cathartic normalization. Like, I want people to get a sense of, oh, like if this guy can do it, I can do it. And so that's what all led up to my writing a book in 2000 or publishing a book in 2014.
Did you write the book yourself, or did you have help?
I wrote it myself, for better or worse. I had lots of help in terms of editing. I had an editor at the publisher. I actually hired a freelance editor, which is really helpful just to have somebody who's a little less busy than the professional editor at the publishing house. And so he was on my dime. So he took his time and really read it carefully and said, here are the parts that don't work. And then I have a big kitchen cabinet. My wife, my brother, several of my bosses, several friends who read. I have a screenwriter friend who's extremely helpful on this. So I give it to a lot of people, and then I get a lot of notes, and then I do all of the rewriting myself. So yeah, I'm a control freak in that I want every word to be mine. However, I'm really open to and really trained in a system where you get a lot of intense feedback, because that's how television news works. It's a very collective activity. So I wanted it to be in my voice, but I also know how fallible I am. And so that the notes really help.
Yeah, I mean, you're also considered a local celebrity in New York City, and you have a wife and very busy life. So how do you find time to write the book yourself when a lot of people would just hire a ghostwriter and just, have a couple of interviews and that kind of thing?
I don't want to portray my decision not to hire a ghostwriter as some sort of noble act. It really, I think it was ego. A lot of it was ego. Well, first of all, I took 5 years to write it, so I didn't rush it. Second, I didn't have a kid at the time, so I had a wife, but she was at the time a more than fully employed physician at an elite institution in Manhattan, and so it was not that hard for me to find the time. Also, I travel a lot at that time. I traveled a lot as a journalist. I would travel around the world and around the country, and so I would just work everywhere I went. And this is in my late 30s, early 40s. And so I had a lot of energy. Now I'm 52. And, like I said, 5 or 6 years into writing my next book, I don't have a day job the way I used to, but I also have less energy. I'm not as sort of like, and I'm not the Energizer bunny I used to be. And sometimes I just have to lie down on the floor in the middle of writing.
And this being your first book, it took, many, many years. Were you doubtful that people, I mean, it's became really popular and New York Times bestseller, but during the process of those handful of years, were you doubtful that this book was going to be any good for anyone?
Every day. And the world was aiding and abetting in that doubt. I shopped the book around to a million publishers. Nobody wanted it.
Did you write it first and then shop it, or you had the proposal and then you shopped it?
I had several chapters and a proposal.
Okay.
And nobody wanted it. One editor bit and paid me very little money. And it didn't matter to me.
What was the main feedback? What were they saying?
I didn't get any feedback. They were just like, pass. I remember I was standing with my literary agent 2 or 3 days after the book came out. And again, I did not expect this book to be popular. And it was really taking off within days. And he showed me an email from one of the editors who had passed. And all it said was, fuck.
Wait, your mom even told you not to publish the book.
My mom, yes, but not that she thought the book was bad, but my mom was worried that my admitting that I had panic attacks and did cocaine and all that stuff, that was going to tank my career. Because bear in mind, we've gone through a lot of cultural changes since 2014. Yeah. Now it's like really widely acceptable to talk about mental health. But it was not at that time, definitely not for anchormen, and so it was a really risky move. And my publisher was so unenthusiastic about the book that she tried to bargain me up to 30% happier, and because she thought that would be a better title, and she only printed 15,000 copies. So within days they ran out of books, right. and that was because just to say, it's not that the book was that amazing and that's why it sold. It's because I worked for the biggest media company in the world, Disney, which owns ABC News. And so all of my bosses and colleagues, like especially Diane Sawyer, actually, who we've already referenced, were insanely supportive of this. And Diane did 2 stories on the evening news about the book. I was on Good Morning America twice. I did a full half hour on Nightline. I was on The View. Like everybody, all of the shows within the Disney ABC News family supported the hell out of this. I haven't thought about this in a minute, but it's moving even to recount that. And that's why the book, especially at first, did so well, because my colleagues were really in my corner. And that was, I think, really amazing. I will say that Barbara Walters, when she heard I was writing, she heard about the book several years before it came out. She literally said the words, "Don't quit your day job."
Do you think they read the book, or they just were really supportive of you and they just wanted to help you get?
Diane read the book and gave me notes. And the president of ABC News, who then went on to be the president of all of ABC, Ben Sherwood, read it twice and gave me notes both times. After the first time he read it, I did a major rewrite, and it was already, you'll know these technical terms, it was already in first pass. So I had already gone through a copy edit. Right. And Ben and one other person came back with some pretty significant notes, and I did a frantic rewrite.
What were some of the notes? Minute. I'm just curious. Like, what did they tell you to do more or less?
It was really about the issue of likability. That I was portraying myself in some rather lazy ways. That I was very careful in how I wrote about other people, but in writing about myself, I kind of made myself look a little crazy. And so I really went back and worked on that. And over the course of 3 days before the drop dead deadline, I read it aloud to my wife. And she would just stop me every other sentence and say, "You repeated that word," or "You sound like a douchebag there," or whatever. And I just I sweated and toiled over this thing, like right up until the end. And I think my doubt, there's good doubt and pernicious doubt. And I think a lot of my doubt about the quality of the book over the 5 years, to get back to your original question, was well placed. Yeah. I was a C-level network newsman writing about a very niche concern, meditation. And I was my first book, so I didn't know how to write a book. I was teaching myself how to write a book while I wrote it, and it wasn't very good. And so I think through stubbornness and refusing to give up, I made it passable by the end. I would like to say that there is a good kind of stubbornness and a bad kind of stubbornness, and I am guilty of both. One of my strengths is that I really, if I get an idea, I will not let it go. But that's also an interpersonal weakness and I've really done a lot of work on this to have more of an open mind about lots of things in the world. And so, yeah, it's a mixed blessing.
So every book I've written, with the exception of my most recent book, Travel Light, the publisher has given me the title. This is what we're going to call the book, right? Every now and again, they'll let me give them some of my ideas of what titles I want. I remember when I interviewed Herbert Benson about the relaxation response, he said he came up with that term when he was shaving one day. And I'm just curious, what's the backstory with 10% happier? Were you on the toilet? How did you come up with this this term?
You need to call me before you write your next book, and I'm going to give you a buck up speech. It's because you should be insistent that you get the title you want. It's your thing. Yes, and they did try. They also, not only did they try to get me to go with 30% happier, but they also mocked up a cover with the title "Be Happy Now," and I had a fit. Because like the whole thing is, the whole idea was I wanted to write something that had more of a skeptical edge, that was funny. And so "Be Happy Now" is like the exact opposite of that. So it was not only was it a terrible title, but it was also like they weren't listening to me. They didn't have any sense of what I was trying to do. And so I was very frustrated. Actually, so to answer your question, as discussed earlier, I got very interested in meditation a little bit before the world got interested in it. So in 2009, 2010, I'm doing my first, I'm really committing to a daily practice. In 2010, I did my first meditation retreat, a 10-day silent meditation retreat. And then I came home from that retreat, and one of my very close colleagues, a friend, Chris Sebastian, I mentioned to her that I'd done this retreat, and she was like, "What is the matter with you? Why would you do that? And why are you meditating at all? Like, what you used to be cool. Like, why is this happening?" And I said, "Oh, because it makes me like 10% happier." And I could see the whole look on her face change from scorn to like interest. And I thought, okay, this is my shtick. This is how I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to counter program against the reckless overpromising that happens in the darker precincts of the self-help world. And hopefully people will get the joke that you can't quantify happiness in that way. And so it's like, it's kind of multi-layered. And, now though that I'm stuck with math for the rest of my life, because people are always asking me, like, what do you mean by 10% happier? What I mean is that marginal perfection is not on offer, but marginal increases in happiness, that is on offer. And like any good investment, the 10% will compound annually. All of the mental states that you want. And at the end of the day, all you really want is positive mental states. You might think you want achievements or a new car. I just bought a new car today, a used car actually. You might think that's what you want, but really what you want is the state of mind that accompanies that. Pride, connection, recognition, a sense of achievement, happiness, peace of mind. All of these mental states, these are not factory settings that are unalterable. They are skills that you can train. And that is what I'm trying to signal through 10% happier. It's like, yeah, you can take responsibility for this shit. And no matter how bad you fucked up in the past, or no matter how badly the world has screwed you, you have some agency here. Doesn't alleviate your prior screw-ups or the injustices in the world, but it's this little pocket of agency that is very powerful. And so that's really what I'm trying to signal there. And I'm actually in a fight with my current editor about the title for my next book, and I plan to beat this will not surprise anybody listening thus far, very stubborn in defense of my idea.
All right. So 10% happier, 10% happier becomes a runaway, crazy bestseller. I looked at it today. It's got like 19,000 reviews, which is insane. And you, having taken this sort of nuanced approach to this idea of becoming a little bit happier as a result of this practice, are now thrust into being seen, I'm sure, by a lot of people as a meditation guru, a meditation, the embodiment of the practice. How are you navigating that? Trying to keep it real, trying to be authentic, trying to tell the truth of your experience while you have essentially the world treating you like you're, right up there with the Dalai Lama and Eckhart Tolle.
That's not quite what happened, luckily. I mean, a lot of complicated shit happened, but it's not like the world started treating me like I was the Dalai Lama. And I did not start to think I was the Dalai Lama. I have lots of flaws, but I'm not that delusional. I think because the whole brand was built around me being a fuck up, like it was all based on a cocaine fueled panic attack. And the book was called 10% Happier. I think like built into the whole endeavor was the idea of, oh yeah, this is an unlikely meditation evangelist, somebody who we can relate to. So I was protected in that way, protected from my own ego and protected from other people projecting too much on me, I think, in that way. That being said, the universe started to rain down upon me lots of opportunities. Mm-hmm. So I got a book deal to write 3 more books. I started a podcast. I started a meditation app with venture capital funding. I started giving all these speeches. I started getting invited onto big TV shows that I'd only ever seen on TV. And that was complex because it really kicked into high gear this kind of acquisitiveness, this back to the lifestyles of the rich and famous, this idea of this hyper ambition, which I now really see is rooted in fear. And so that was complicated. And as part of the overcommitting that I then did, because I kept my job at ABC News, I was the anchor of Nightline. I was the anchor of the weekend edition of GMA, Good Morning America. I was a traveling investigative reporter around the world. I had a meditation app, a podcast, a multi-book deal. I was doing all of this at the same time. And then in the middle of that, we had a kid, our first kid, our only child. And I was way overcommitted. And I was being a dick. And so it wasn't so much that I fell into the trap of thinking I was God's gift or anything like that. It was more that it weaseled its way. This opportunity weaseled its way right into one of my vulnerabilities, which is this fear-based greed.
Yeah, that was going to be another one of my questions. But I have a friend who wrote, I think it's to date the most popular vegan book in the world, and it's this no nonsense book called Skinny Bitch, where she uses a lot of community.
Yeah.
And she got to the point several years later where she said people were expecting her to still show up like that and be cursing and keeping it real, and she didn't feel like that anymore. And I'm curious if there's anything about your journey with presenting yourself as this sort of skeptic that after having practiced meditation for many years, you realize I'm not really the person I was when I first started this journey, but people are still expecting me to show up as this person. Is there any truth to that with your experience?
It's a bit of a different spin. I think the book was the first time in my life I'd ever been publicly honest and real. I had been an anchor man for 20 years leading up to that, which is inherently a bullshit job, right? I mean, like it's an important job and I loved doing it and I actually miss it, but you're not yourself when you're anchoring the news, right? At least I wasn't. I think it's the very rare person that can be really authentic as they're delivering the news. Interestingly, over time, especially as a morning news anchor in my later years, I actually was getting closer to that. Because I was starting to take myself a little less seriously and I was a little older and more comfortable in my skin. And I'd had this experience of getting up and admitting to the world the most embarrassing shit of my life and getting a standing ovation, which is really encouraging. Not in that I was thinking like I'm the man, although I guess I thought that a little bit, but mostly it was like a relief that you can be honest. And so now I feel like as a result of that book, I am way more myself than I've ever been. And the version of me that is talking to you right now, I do swear a lot. Like, if I'm around the house, I swear a lot. And yeah, and I tell embarrassing stories, and this is me. In terms of my skepticism about meditation, that has obviously changed. So it's almost 10 years since the book came out. It's about 15 years since I started meditating. I have a very different attitude about it now, but I actually had this attitude when the book came out. By the end of 10% Happier, the story, I'm like a pretty committed Buddhist, and that is what I am today. And I'm even less skeptical now, of course, and my practice has, I hope, moved forward. And I'm even, more interested in esoteric, deep end aspects of the practice. But no, I don't feel trapped by it at all. And I think part of it is I took this big risk to be fully myself in that book, and therefore it didn't create a prison for me because it was just the truth.
Yeah. What's your relationship like with terms like reincarnation, karma, destiny, um, enlightenment as a practicing Buddhist?
Uh, I have like I hope an intellectually humble approach to all of this, because I've not experienced reincarnation firsthand to my memory, nor am I enlightened. Um, Karma, I think, is actually something you can explain in very down to earth terms.
Mhm.
Destiny, I'll set aside because I'm not sure I believe in that at all. But karma, in the Buddhist sense, is just cause and effect. This happens, so that happens. Light invites me on his podcast, so I'm on his podcast. And we exist on the lip of a vast ocean, an unfathomably large ocean of causes and conditions that have landed us in this very moment, dating back to the Big Bang and perhaps beyond. This has happened, and then that happened, and this happened, and that happened, and a bunch of Jews got chased out of uh, Eastern Europe, and now I live here. And there's just unbelievable. Two nerds met at Stanford Medical School and had a baby, and now I'm here. And so, like, there's all of this stuff that has happened to lead us to right now. That's my understanding of karma. Enlightenment, what's interesting about enlightenment is it sounds like this serene subject, and I guess if you were enlightened, it must be serene. But as a subject matter, as soon as you start talking about enlightenment, you're in an argument, because there are all these different traditions, even within Buddhism, and they have different conceptions of what is nirvana, how does one achieve it, what are the impacts of that experience, how many times you need to experience it to be fully enlightened. And so I find all that very interesting, but I have to be humble because I have not, I've never had an experience of nirvana or enlightenment. And then finally, about on reincarnation, again, I have no evidence. I'm an agnostic. I'm not going to sit here and say it's not true. But I do have this sense, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. I have this like sense for which I have no evidence, just an increasing suspicion that maybe it's true. And I don't know why I feel that way. Maybe I've just spent too much time in Buddhist circles, but yeah. Do you feel that way as well?
Yeah, I think, for me, the spiritual path is holding a space for things that you don't have a lot of evidence for, but it resonates on a deep level.
Yeah.
And I interviewed this guy, Dr. Jim Tucker, on my podcast. Have you heard of him before?
Mm-mm.
So he's out of
From Virginia?
Yeah, University of
Yeah,
Virginia.
Yeah. He's on Netflix. He's
Yes,
incredible.
yes. So he came on and talked about the scientific approach to reincarnation and how he studies these cases that are almost exclusively reported by young children
Mhm.
within below the age of 6, and they still have a memory of things that they've experienced from a time that it doesn't relate to what they're currently experiencing, and it's very accurate stuff, and it's really compelling. I think you should have them on your podcast if you're interested, but I think
I
it would
should.
lead to an amazing conversation
I
about that.
It's interesting, that so there's a Netflix series, I think it's called After Death or something like
Yeah,
that,
something
or
like that,
Surviving
yeah.
Death or something like
Mhm.
that. Uh, and one of the episodes about reincarnation, they follow him as he interviews these kids who have these very vivid memories of
Mhm.
past lives, and he gives them these tests, and they're able
Yeah.
to
He shows
know.
them pictures, one
Yes,
of, like,
yes,
a high school that they claim they attended and another just random high school, and he sees that they can recognize which one is the one that they recognize it with, like, 95% accuracy or something
yes,
like that.
yes. So I was watching that one night here at our house with Joseph Goldstein, who's this
Mm,
eminent Buddhist teacher. He's my meditation teacher. I mean, he's
okay.
almost 80 years old, just a legend in the meditation world. And
Mhm.
he was spending the weekend with us, and he, my wife and son had gone to bed, and he and I were up late watching Netflix, and we watched that together. And he knows I'm a skeptic, and at the end of it, he looked over at me and said, "See." And yeah, and I found it very compelling. I did later learn that there are some, it's I'm not sure how strong the science is here
Mhm.
really, but those anecdotal stories are very compelling. I certainly wouldn't pound the table and say that they're absolute proof, but you know that seeing stories like that, and then I don't know, just having this sense that it's often talked about, the third law of thermodynamics: energy cannot be created or destroyed. So if this mind stream that we're in, that we mistakenly claim as our own, if this mental energy that is us on some very hard to find level, does that just completely dissipate when we die, or is it possible that it goes on in some other form? I don't know. I mean, we're getting pretty mystical here, but I'm certainly open to that.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody can say definitively when you're in a body, that this is how it is until you die and you get to actually see, okay, is there anything after this? But what I've been trying to do, and I encourage people who follow my work to do, is just to adopt the belief that empowers you the most, since no one can say definitively one way or the other if reincarnation is real, if it's not real. Just which one of those two approaches makes you feel like you can be more yourself, makes you feel like you could be more authentic. And that's the lens through which I try to present this stuff, because I agree it can be a little bit off-putting if you're especially if you're very science minded, this idea of enlightenment even, where it can kind of veer off into this sort of spiritual competition, who's the most enlightened or what's the most enlightened response to this scenario. And I have equated enlightenment with just being authentic, just being yourself. The degree to which you can be yourself is the degree to which you are enlightened, meaning you understand that you may be a spirit, but you're also having the human experience. And so everyone else is as well. And I think when we get upset with people, when we get offended by people, in a way, it's because we're holding them to a higher standard than we even hold ourselves to.
Mm.
And so one of the consequences of moving closer towards enlightenment is you're not offended as much. You don't get upset as much. And if you do get upset or offended, it passes more quickly. So that's kind of my understanding about the whole
Well, I'm definitely not enlightened because I get pissed off all the time.
thing.
I I would add that it's another way to think about it is, well, Joseph Goldstein, who we just talked about, often describes enlightenment as kind of lightening up
Mhm.
and not
Yeah,
taking yourself so seriously. I
exactly.
sometimes describe it as like pulling your head out of your ass.
Mhm.
Um, I heard a really interesting definition of morality the other day. That's such a loaded term, obviously. But I had this professor on from Yale, Tamar Gendler, and she was talking about, she studies ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, and she described morality as the consciousness that there are other people on the planet beside just you.
Mhm.
And, I think enlightenment is like kind of lowering the ego walls, getting a sense that you're not this isolated ego peering fretfully out at the world through your eye sockets, that in fact you are inextricably interwoven into something larger. This is the experience people have when they take psychedelics.
Mhm.
Um, and this is like at the core of every religious and mystical tradition. And yeah, I think it's also the way to be happier. You know, what's your mind like? I often tell people to think about this. So, what's your mind like when you hold the door open for somebody? It's a tiny little moment. But if you're paying attention, it feels pretty good, and you're probably not worried about your own bullshit at that moment. That is that is like infinitely scalable to, organize your life around being useful. It doesn't mean you have to like wear a hair shirt and, give away all of your possessions, but you can orient your life around the question that another great spiritual teacher, Ram Dass, has asked his students to pose, which is, how can I help?
Mm.
And again, we're not saints. I'm not. So I lose that question sometimes, but just to have it, like I got a little tattoo recently on my wrist, FTBOAB. It's an acronym for a Buddhist expression for the benefit of all beings. It's a little bit cheesy in my opinion, but it's just a great reminder. I look here a lot, because my watch is here on my left wrist, and I look down a lot to look at my watch, or to, if I'm working out, you look down sometimes, and just anything you can do to remember to wake up, pull your head out of your ass. And again, you are part of all beings, so this doesn't have to be tragic altruism where you're giving away. You're a being worthy of giving a shit about too.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but anything you can do to remind yourself to wake up, to get out of the sleepwalking that most of us do in most of our lives, that's a step toward what you might call enlightenment, or if you don't like that term, just like improvement.
Mhm. What about toxic positivity? I kind of have a love-hate relationship with this term. What's your thinking on toxic positivity?
Like going on Instagram and everybody's got hashtag blessed and things like that.
Yeah, I guess so.
It just feels, that kind of move feels forced,
Mhm.
earnest, inauthentic. Um, Life is amazing. I mean, there's so much positive stuff in the world, and we are wired to see the negative. We have an evolutionarily wired negativity bias, and so it's great to try to counteract that in some ways, to tune into all the amazing stuff that's happening around you all the time. That being said, life is also ugly and difficult and bloody and messy and unfair, and you don't wanna overlook that either, so I think it's just about having a balanced view. How does that sound to you?
Well, I think, like, to your point, we're wired for pointing out all the ways life is unfair and life is bloody and messy and all of that. And so I think it's not really all that remarkable to just reiterate how screwed up everything is. And it could be, I think it could be useful personally, just to, like, for instance, when I have a very small cohort of friends, and a lot of my friends challenge my beliefs, because I can be negative sometimes. Obviously, I'm human, and I can be in a situation where I'm feeling like I'm being slighted or taken advantage of, and I'll report to these friends of mine, this or that happened, and they'll kind of help me see the bigger picture. And that's one of the reasons why I value these particular, like, I don't want somebody telling, basically reiterating the negative aspects of it or
Right, right.
instigating something. That's not going to make me feel better. But also understand that, I'm very much uh, asking for that. And there's a reciprocity within those dynamics where I'm also doing the same thing for them. And maybe not everybody has that same level of reciprocity. So, like anything, I think there's a time and place for it. For if you're in a space for that, to have the positivity reinforced in an authentic way as well. And for me, that means you're not making the other person out to be the villain, and you're not making yourself out to be the victim. So there's within that sort of gray area, there's some learnings there, and the opportunity is to take what's useful and to leave the rest of it behind.
Two expressions are coming to mind as I'm listening to you talk. One is, I forget who said this first one, but when it's relevant to the idea of recognizing that the world is both beautiful and horrifying. And what do you do in response to this reality? And the expression is participate joyfully in the sorrows of the world.
Hmm.
And I like that. That captures the paradox. And I think that's the sane approach. And then the other expression that came to mind, and I heard this from Robert Waldinger, who is the guy who's the latest chief of a long-running multi-generational study of people who live in the Boston area, been studying people there for like 80 or 90 years and looking at who lives the longest and why. And what comes screaming through the data is that the most important variable is the quality of your relationships. And how does that impact your longevity? Because stress is the biggest killer, and stress can be reduced through doing what we were evolutionarily wired to do, which is to be with other people. And so the expression that he uses that came to mind when you were describing your friendships is never worry alone.
Like that. Never worry alone. When I met my teacher in 2003, I knew within about 10 minutes that this man was meant to become my teacher, and I was going to learn a lot from him. And you've mentioned Joseph Goldstein, and I'm sure somebody here listening to this is thinking, I don't have a meditation teacher. Like, how did you know he was meant to be your teacher? What does that even mean to you? What is a teacher Dan Harris relationship like when it comes to meditation? Do you guys talk on a regular basis? Do you listen to his recordings? Do you hang out all the time? And if someone's listening to this and they don't have a teacher, what can they do to locate a teacher? Do you need a
This is
teacher?
an excellent question. I'll start by talking about my relationship with Joseph. It's a bit idiosyncratic, and then I'll try to say something more generally useful. I met Joseph on my first meditation retreat. I met him through meditation retreats, especially with Joseph, are almost impossible to get into. So just like I got into Colby because I had a connection, because I'm, like
You
the
got a
epitome. I've got all the privileges, literally every one. I have them all, except for I'm not tall. I'm short, so I don't have that one. But I got everything else: white, male, straight, wealthy, all that stuff. So this is another example of my overweening privilege. But Sam Harris, we're not related, but he's a very famous atheist writer and meditation proponent and a good friend, and I kind of think of him as a mentor, really. Sam is an old friend of Joseph's, and Sam was trying to get me to go on my first meditation retreat, and he got me into this retreat with Joseph. And because I really admire Sam, I already, I was already primed to really like Joseph. But then during the course of this 10-day meditation retreat, this guy would get up and give these talks. First of all, he's the exact same age as my dad. And like my dad, he's a New York Jew. And like my dad, he's super brainy. And my dad went into medicine, but this guy, Joseph, took that same intellectual horsepower and applied it to the Dharma. And he talked about the Dharma with the same sort of sommelier energy that my dad would talk about medicine. And I just found that irresistible. He was so smart, so funny. He grew up in a bungalow colony, a kind of like hotel for Jews in the Catskills. And it was the type of place where comedians would come through every Saturday night, like guys like named Shecky or whatever, come through and work the crowd. And so he has that Borscht Belt humor, literally Borscht Belt. That's where he grew up. He has that humor, which is, of course, like a huge part of my family upbringing. And so to have this guy who was so smart, so insightful, saying so many things that really opened my mind and doing it with a sense of humor, it was just like a perfect combination. And I basically just forced him to be my friend. And we knew some people in common, and so I would see him in some of these settings, and he basically offered me one day he's like, "Do you want me to be your meditation teacher?" I remember we were at dinner with a group of people, and he said that to me pretty casually, and somebody else at the table kicked me under the table and was like, "That's a big deal. You should take advantage of that." So I didn't really understand what a big deal it was. And it's not like, I'm like sitting at the feet of the master on the regular, and he's calling me grasshopper and instructing me in the ways of the world all the time. He's, in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about gurus as like a spiritual friend, literally friend. So he's like a friend or an uncle, and he just knows a lot about this thing that I really care about. And so I call him when I have problems in my life. I call him to talk about my practice. I go on meditation retreat once or twice a year with him. He's got, he'll come stay with us just socially. He's just a huge part of my life. And for all of the things I'm grateful for, and I keep making jokes about how many advantages I've had in my life because I really tried to be grateful for them. My relationship with Joseph is right up there. For this like kind of unearned gift that I've received. I'm very grateful for that. In terms of how other people can get a teacher, this is a tricky thing, and there is no real system for this. And I think it's something that it's kind of like from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it's kind of an opening in the market. Like there should be a better system for matching people with teachers. If there's a teacher who you come across, on Light's podcast or my podcast, or if you use a meditation app and you listen to, say you use the Calm meditation app and you listen to Jeff Warren on there, or Lama Rod Owens, who's both those guys are people that I'm very big fans of. You go to their websites and hit the contact button and ask, can I be your student? And maybe it's that you'll be part of a group Zoom teaching, or maybe they're willing to do one-on-one work with you. I think that you just kind of have to poke around and see what you can get. I think showing up in person to retreats or talks, meditation teachers giving talks, I think that's another way to meet people. There is no real system here, and I think that's a shame.
Do you consider yourself to be a bit of a meditation teacher? And do you have people wanting to be your student?
No, I don't. I have I have a very high bar for what I think. I'm the child of two doctors. I'm married to a doctor, and I think meditation teachers have that kind of training. They and I would include you in this. You talked about meeting your teacher in 2003, 20 years ago. That is a lot of work. A silent meditation retreat, apprenticing as a teacher, um, months and months and years of work and study. I'm not calling myself an ignoramus. I've written a few books about this. I've done some meditation retreats, but it's not on the level with the amount of seated practice that one needs to do to truly get under the hood of somebody else's mind, which is a position of great responsibility. I mean, there's a reason why there's a etymological relationship between the word meditation and medicine. I mean, this is, and they call the Buddha the great physician. This is like, you have a responsibility to do no harm here. And so I can answer meditation questions for sure, but I tend to answer it with the frame of, well, here's what's worked for me, or here's in my experience how this can go. I tend not to be super prescriptive for people because I just don't feel like I've earned that position the way, for example, you have.
Mhm. And you've talked about how consistent you've been over the years and you rarely miss a meditation. And I heard you on this other interview, you were talking about a 360 review that you had received the first time after all these years of meditation. And it was
Yeah.
kind of shocking. Would you mind speaking a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. No,
What
yeah,
is a
I alluded.
360 review?
Sure, sure, sure. I alluded to this. I'll answer that. I alluded to this a little bit earlier when I talked about the fact that I wrote this book. It became super successful, and it's like this book about controlling your ego put my ego on steroids. And again, it wasn't like I had a guru complex. It was more just that this super ambitious part of me kicked into high gear in ways that were really unhelpful. And a few years into this jag of experiencing this success, I was getting ready to write my third book. So I wrote 10% Happier, and then I wrote a little how to meditate book called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. And before that book even came out, I convened a meeting with my brain trust, my like editor, my brother, my wife, my kitchen cabinet, and we were trying to figure out what my next book was going to be. And I wanted it to be about love, or at the time I was considering it to be about compassion. When I talk about meditation, it's mostly mindfulness meditation, which is derived from Buddhism, but taught in a pretty secular way now, where you focus on your breath, and then every time you get distracted, you start again and again and again. And this is a great way to develop a kind of self-awareness that's called mindfulness, which allows you to see the voice in your head, your ego, so that you're not so owned by it. There are companion practices that have been taught for 2,600 years that are designed to make you friendlier, more compassionate. And those practices have not gotten a lot of airtime in the mindfulness revolution and the hype around meditation. So I had this idea, this is back in like late 2017, early 2018, that, I want to do a book to popularize these flavors of meditation. And the idea was it was going to be a how-to book, not like a big memoir. But we wanted it to have a narrative overlay. So the idea came up that my wife was saying, you should talk to the people in your life and figure out what they think you should work on. And then that could be the inciting event, the narrative propulsion for the book. And which of course was very well played on her part, because she was basically designing a book in which her husband becomes even less of a shitbag, which was smart. And I tip my hat to her. And so then the idea came up, well, Dan, why don't you have a 360 review? A 360 review is something that is often used in corporate context, where an executive will a coaching service, like an executive coach, will come in and identify a specific executive, and then they will run an anonymous survey of that executive's bosses, peers, and direct reports to get a sense of this person's strengths and weaknesses. My idea was that I would get the colonoscopy version of that, which would also include my wife, my brother, Joseph Goldstein, Jeff Warren, so friends, meditation teachers. And so we got 16 people from ABC News, from my personal life, from my company, the meditation app company that I co-founded. And they did this anonymous survey, and I get this 39-page report filled with blind quotes. And I did not think it was going to be that bad. I really didn't think it was going to be that bad. I didn't think it was going to be awesome, but I really didn't think it was going to be that bad. And it was bad, really bad. And it was people pointing out these things that are now very clear to me, which is that I overcommitted, and that could make me really short and grumpy. I am stubborn in good ways and in bad ways. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is like this kind of emotional guardedness, that where people felt like I had a ceiling on my emotional capacity. Many people had never seen me sad, for example. They had definitely seen me angry. There were comments about how, and this was particularly humiliating, that I could be very rough with my humor and also quite tough on junior staffers, which I found to be very embarrassing, because I didn't think I was that kind of person, but I definitely was. And so I had this 360 review, and at that point I was like, oh, well, I can't write this book, and I probably should quit talking about meditation at all, because I'm clearly an asshole. And I went into the fetal position for several days. And then I finally realized, through some good coaching and talking to, friends and family, that this was an opportunity. And it was an opportunity to do better at my life, but also, like, this is a better book than the one I had in mind. And it actually should be a memoir. And I got this huge wake up as a self-help guru, no less. And what am I going to do about it? And so that was in 2018, more than 5 years ago. And I have spent the last 5 years basically single-mindedly working on this, and working on addressing all of the things that came up in that 360 review. 3 years afterwards, I got another 360. It was totally different. Totally different. After reading it, my wife said, congratulations, now you're boring. But she was mostly kidding. But, I've done a lot of work on it. I continue to do a lot of work on it. And part of the reason why the book is taking so long is that I want these learnings to really like get into my marrow, into my molecules, so that I can teach from scars, not wounds, so that I can turn around and really explain to you what I've learned, in an open, undefended way. And so that's really the number one project in my life right now.
Mm. And how did you know it was time to pivot from journalism, from being a full-time journalist? Was
Well,
it?
the 360 review was a huge part of that. Like it was obvious that like I was doing too much. It was
Mm,
insane. What my schedule was insane. And so my coach, my executive coach who administered the 360 was like, don't make any changes immediately. And so I didn't. I let it sink in for a second. But then about 6 to 12 months after the 360, I went part-time at ABC News. I quit Nightline, and all I did, my job responsibilities were pared down to anchoring Weekend Good Morning America and then doing big prestige special investigative stories around the world. So I've spent time with Amazonian, indigenous tribes. I've spent time with the drug cartels in Mexico, chasing down pedophiles in Cambodia. Like I did big, like, sort of, award-winning, journalistic endeavors. And so, which I really love doing, still love it. I miss that. But even after a while, it was clear that like even that was too much. I was still doing too much. And so so eventually, 2 years ago, I retired from ABC News entirely, which was a huge, like, swallow hard kind of moment. And I'm even stepping away from my meditation app. I am really paring it down to working on this book and then whatever books I do after that, my podcast, and speeches, and I might do some TV work, but it will be related to happiness and meditation. So I'm exploring some projects in that zone, but I'm really, really trying to focus.
and you mentioned starting a newsletter when we first started this conversation. Is that something you're going to be heavily involved with, or is it something that you have a team working on and you're going to kind of, you know, be a consultant on?
I did mention that I'm a bit of a control freak, so I do every word of it, but I have somebody on my podcast team, Marissa Schneiderman, who's amazing. And so I basically all week long I send her the things that I want to put in the newsletter, and she like kind of puts it together, sends it back to me, and then I rewrite it. And it's a very simple newsletter where I include a bunch of things that crossed my radar in the past week that I think you might find interesting. Then I do some like behind the scenes stuff on my podcast, upcoming guests, maybe some pictures of some stuff that you haven't seen, and then also just like a list of my upcoming events, retreats I'm leading, or whatever it is, or speeches I'm giving. And so it's very simple, but it's really designed to, I mean, I know I imagine you do a lot of these things. It's like just create a little community of people who are interested in my work, and then I can expose these folks to the work of people that I care about. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed this as a podcast host. I mean, one of the great joys of having any sort of platform is finding people whose work you admire and
Mhm.
exposing that work to the world. I got to do that with you back in 2018. And so that's a huge source of pleasure for me.
And taking it back a little bit further in childhood, just so we can understand how you got to that point on June 2004, where you had that meltdown, the panic attack, um, on live television. So, can you just give us a bit of a montage of how you grew up and what led you to journalism?
Yeah, I had like an unfathomably privileged upbringing. I was raised by two physicians in Boston, or outside of Boston, in a little town called Newton. And they were and are happily married, very, very highly educated, great parents. Let's see, what else can I say? I was a rebellious kid, shitty student. Got into college, but only because my dad knew the dean. He had actually saved the life of the dean's wife. Um,
You needed a
so
hookup to get into Colby College?
yeah, I did. I needed a hookup. Yeah. So yeah, born on third base firmly, and then went to Colby College, where I finally got my act together. I got very interested in academics and just being more serious about life generally, and graduated and started getting into journalism. And then I ended up working at ABC News for 21 years, and now I'm a washed up anchorman, ex anchorman.
So can we, this is like a pivotal moment in your backstory, this panic attack thing that you experienced. And I would love to just double click on that, just to enlighten the listener about where you've come from. Because something I haven't really talked about before, Dan, is I have also experienced what I think was a panic attack. I'm not positive about this, but get this. It happened when I was teaching meditation. So when I was teaching meditation, part of my experience is I do this whole puja ceremony. So I went to India and I learned how to do this whole puja ceremony, which is where you sing this song in Sanskrit. And it's about a 3.5 minute long song. Nobody knows what the hell I'm saying, but I know what I'm saying. And you're doing offerings, flowers, fruit, and da 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 da. And I found myself being overly sort of worried about, what if I mess up? What if I miss a word? What if I forget how to end this thing? And my heart starts racing. And, it's kind of like you have the outer body experience. And I start feeling myself breathing a lot more rapidly. And I ended up getting through the whole thing, but I was like, oh, it's really interesting how I'm in this meditation space, and I've been meditating for many, many years. And yet I'm experiencing this thing. And, when you have something like that happen, especially when everyone's looking to you to be the person that's going to give them the thing that's going to help them from not, keep them from having panic attacks. It's very confronting. And it's not something I've ever talked about before. But I feel like because you've been so open about your experiences, it makes me want to share my experiences. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with that? Was that the first time it ever happened? How did you know you were having a panic attack? What were some of your symptoms?
It's amazing how openness is contagious. It's like,
as
soon as you admit that you're fucked up, everybody's comfortable admitting that they're fucked up. And it's like, I find that to be very powerful, actually. I heard this term, I didn't make it up, and but I like it. Cathartic normalization. That if you're willing to talk about the most embarrassing stuff that ever happened to you, you have to kind of do it in the right way. A friend of mine, I have a close friend named Sebene Selassie, who's a meditation teacher, and she quotes somebody else whose name I'm going to forget, who says that it's best to teach from scars, not wounds. So if you're talking about, especially if you're in a teaching position, if you're talking about stuff that you've actually metabolized and dealt with, then it can be very useful. But I think for other people, even just saying what you're dealing with actively right now can be really helpful, as long as you're not, you don't want to be oversharing. And that's a funny and interesting line that we can get to. But let me just get back to you in the panic or anxiety that you experienced. And you can think of panic as just anxiety on steroids. And so anxiety can come with an elevated heart rate, and but panic, I think, is when I'm not truly an expert in this. I'm an expert in having panic attacks. I'm not necessarily an expert in describing them, but I do think that if in order for it to be a true panic attack, and I could be wrong about this, and if psychiatrists are listening, I say this with apologies. It's a full fight or flight response. And so what you experienced may have been just high anxiety or panic. I don't know exactly where to draw that line. And one thing that came to mind when you were talking about it is one component of panic. And I just learned this recently, even though I knew it intuitively, I didn't really know it explicitly until a recent guest on my podcast explained it to me, that a component of panic is a fear of social rejection. So this is why so many people freak out in public speaking, because social rejection, we are wired to have that as perhaps the primordial fear, because during evolution times, a lonely human was likely a dead human. The only way we could survive was through cooperation and collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. So it's possible, I could imagine, and I'm projecting here, that you're up there, you're worried about somehow the sneaky little thought infiltrated your mind stream of, am I doing this puja right? And then, oh my God, all these people are watching me and I'm starting to panic. But I'm the guy who's supposed to be the help you calm down guy. And now I'm panicking and shit, maybe they can see it. And now you panic more. And then there's this toilet vortex that happens as the mental proliferation interacts with the physiological response. And the more panic you feel in your body, the more your mind freaks out. And the more your mind freaks out, the more the body freaks out. And so anyway, is any of what I'm describing landing to you, for you?
Yeah, 100%. That's exactly how it went down. And like I'd never experienced anything like that before, which is really odd until that moment. And I from what I gather, you also had that experience where you never had anything close to that happening as a professional on live television, having done this thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Why do you think it happens at that time as opposed to any other time?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I had always had stage fright.
Mhm.
Um, and I have joked that my career up until that point was a triumph of narcissism over fear, because I had very bad stage fright and did it anyway, because I liked being on television. I'd never had a full-on panic attack on the air, but I'd had a few like dicey moments. I had had full-on panic attacks, however, smoking weed as a teenager. Those were my first panic attacks. So my brain knew how to do it, and unfortunately, once your brain learns how to do it, it perfects the art. Why I think it happened for the first time in a full blown way in that June of 2004, on that morning on Good Morning America, is that I had a new cocaine habit, which can change your brain chemistry. I, just to be clear, was not high while I was on the air, but I had spent a lot of time in the preceding years between 9/11 and the panic attack as a newly minted war correspondent. So I was in Afghanistan and I covered the second intifada in Israel and Palestine. And I spent a lot of time in Iraq, months and months and months and months in Iraq. And that messed me up a little bit. Then I started experimenting with cocaine a little bit because it made me feel better. And after I had the panic attack, I went to a shrink who explained to me that even though I wasn't high on the air or even really that close to the morning, it was enough. My drug abuse was enough to change my brain chemistry and make it more likely for me to freak out. So it's an interesting thing about panic, that if your nervous system is degraded, it makes panic much more likely. And so that obviously, if you're putting a lot of unhealthy chemicals into your bloodstream, that as I was doing, that can be a real contributor. And I highly doubt you were doing cocaine, but I mean, it could have been possible that you had a few bad nights sleep, or there was some stressor in your life, economic stress or romantic stress or whatever, that could have contributed in some way. But it's just a useful takeaway for anybody with panic or anxiety, that one of the great preventative moves is to do all the things your mom told you to do, exercise, sleep well, eat right, and meditate, although your mom might not have told you to do that, because those things will keep you in some sort of equilibrium, homeostasis, that will put you in a position where you're less likely to freak out.
Would you say that you were, at the time, you felt like being a journalist and war correspondent and all those things was a part of was it aligned with what you felt like you were here to do? Did you feel like you were living your purpose, your dream, and all of the things?
I don't think I ever thought of my life in terms of purpose. I certainly was living my dream, but that dream was more, I think, egocentric than mission oriented. It was like, I remember growing up watching lifestyles of the rich and famous, and watching movies like Wall Street, And somehow and my parents did not model this for me. They were actually they were ex hippies, and they were quite idealistic actually, and very committed physicians. And so we weren't super wealthy or anything like that. But somehow I think it got in my head that I wanted or needed to be very successful. And TV news struck me as like a great way to do that. And I guess I did have some. I might it's possible I'm being a little too hard on myself, because I think about motivation as a range. And if you're honest and you look at the full range of motivations for anything you do, it will probably span somewhere between idealistic and craven. And so I've just described the craven aspect of my motivation. I would say the idealistic part of it was that I very much believed in journalism and the power and importance of journalism and the importance of bearing witness at the tip of the spear. So for me, it was very important. I thought it was very important to play the role of risking my life to explain to Americans what was being done with their tax dollars overseas. But I don't want to pretend that that was all that motivated me, because it was also curiosity, ambition, desire for, success. But I don't think I would have ever framed it, to get back to your question, in terms of purpose.
So having had the impact that you've had, what's one thing that has surprised you the most about, you initially many years ago said meditation has this big PR problem. You've kind of helped to try to be a solution to that and make it more accessible. Has anything surprised you about 10% happy, the 10% happier movement? Because it is a movement.
I will say, I think what surprised me the most about it, I don't think this, I think this is much, what I'm about to say is much bigger than anything I'm associated with. What I'm really surprised by is how far the culture has come on mental health awareness. And I give a lot of credit to the often maligned Gen Z and millennials, people who are sometimes accused of being, like people my age. I'm a Gen Xer, but boomers and Gen Xers sometimes complain about these younger people who are talking about, they need a, pet bereavement day off. And, like you can't give them feedback. It has to be feed forward. And, they have to be pampered in the workplace. Everybody gets a trophy and all this stuff. And maybe some of that is legit, but I actually think as much as as a curmudgeonly old man, can get a little salty about some of that, I actually think that this focus on basic human rights as it pertains to mental health, and thinking about work in a less militaristic and hierarchical way, I actually think that's a great gift. And so I didn't see that coming. I was trying to make the world more open about mental health, and I'm sure I made some small amount of difference, but something way bigger than me has happened. And I think that's really cool and multi-leveled and, not uncomplicated. There are, maybe I've heard some people argue we're too focused on our mental health. And I read one mental health official saying Mental Health Awareness Day always makes him cringe a little bit because we're too aware of it, and maybe we're over medicated. And there are lots. This is nuanced, but I think in the main, it's very helpful that it's okay to say, yeah, I have panic disorder, and I need some accommodation, and or I have anxiety. I see a shrink, and you don't have to keep that stuff in the closet. I think generally speaking, that's super positive.
Yeah, well, you and I are around the same age, and I grew up in Alabama, and there's not a lot of meditation happening down there, even
No,
still.
yeah,
And it's just interesting to reflect back, on if someone had told me that, in 30 years, you'll be this meditation person, written all these books on meditation, you'll be called Light Watkins. Like I would have been completely shocked by that. And I feel like the same may be true for you, back when you were an aspiring journalist, to someone that tapped you on the shoulder and said, Dan, you're going to be one of the biggest advocates for meditation in the whole world. And you'll have written books and have this thing called an app, and people will be turning to meditation all over the place because of your work. I mean, it's just so amazing how surprising and even ironic life can be. So I just wanted to to acknowledge you for stepping into your curiosity around all of this, which then led you to your purpose. And I'm honored to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Those were very kind words. And um, to to go from Alabama to Light Watkins is no small feat as well. So thank you.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.